no confidential items, have we? Okay then, so if I could ask for any apologies for absence, please. Anybody else? Okay, thank you very much. Are there, it's quite routine this, so are there any declarations of interest from members? Councillor Charlton.
Same declaration as before.
Yeah, I am too, but I think we've declared all these at the beginning of the meeting. Okay, but since I think this is Councillor Charlton's first meeting, so that should be cool. Sorry about the mix-up where you weren't invited previously. I apologise for that, and welcome. Okay, thank you very much. So, are there any other, excuse me, declarations of interest that need to be declared?
Excuse me, Chair. I know I'm not a member of the committee, but I just want to highlight that obviously for item 7, where it's discussions about tenders, that Aon would obviously be interested in re-tendering, and I'm assuming Laura from Hyman's would be in the same position, just so it's noted.
Okay. I'm not aware. Well, it might be appropriate to ask our advisors to withdraw. Can I take advice on that from the officers?
It might be, but it's really only an update on where we are with the process. It's not about who we're selecting or anything. So,
okay, so we're not going to talk particular organisations in this
no,
item.
It's literally just about where we are in the process.
Yeah, so we'll note that declaration, and yeah, it should be all right. If the conversation does go that way, of course, we may have to ask you to just leave the meeting at that point. If I can draw your attention to the minutes of the previous meeting, can we agree those as a true record? First of all, I don't go through them page by page generally, but if anyone agreed. Agreed. Oh, thank you very much. Then okay.
Agreed.
And Jonathan Malin-Smith has his hand up. Jonathan.
Jonathan, you're on mute.
Jonathan, are you on mute or something? I can't hear you. You put your hand down now. Oh, no, you haven't. Can you hear us? No, we can't hear you, Jonathan.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you, Rabia. Chair, I can't hear what you're saying. I don't know what it is.
I can hear.
Everybody else? Online. Everybody else here?
Yes, I can hear.
I can hear well. Well, since you can't hear me, I don't know. But John, can we, John, to write a message or something. You know. Yeah, so if you go ask Mario to have a look at that, but it would appear that it's Jonathan's end that the problem is rather than the rest of the system. So, okay, right. I don't know what that means. Just thumbs up. Okay, so if we could move on then. The next item 4, training. We're going to do some training on the valuation, and McEnroy, who is our actuary, is going to deliver that. Hi, Laura.
Hi, thank you, Chair. I'm just going to share my screen, so please bear with me. Apologies, you might see yourselves for a moment here. There we are. Can I just check that everyone can see the slides?
They're quite small. I don't know if you... oh, everyone else can see them all right, can they? Okay, right. Okay, I'll shut up then. Okay, Laura, back to you.
Okay, thank you, Chair. Okay, yes, so thank you for inviting us today here to give you an overview of the modelling work that we'll be undertaking over the next few months. This is the funding and investment strategy reviews. The purpose of the modelling, you may recall we discussed this modelling at the last Pensions Committee meeting, and you asked us to proceed with that modelling. And the purpose of this will really be to set the contribution strategy for the Council as part of the 2022 actuarial valuation of the fund, and also to inform the investment strategy for the fund, which, for the avoidance of doubt, applies to the whole fund. So that's every employer within the Hackney Pension Fund, not just the Council. As we're talking about both the contribution strategy and the investment strategy, you'll hear from both myself in my capacity as fund actuary, and also Ian Campbell today, who's investment advisor to the fund. And this exercise is something that Ian and myself and our respective teams at Hyman Robertson will be working on together over the course of the coming months. And the benefit of that is really just to allow you to take a holistic approach to funding. And hopefully, as we go through today's presentation, it will become clear why you can't set one part of your funding strategy without having regard to the other. Hopefully that will become clear. So we'll start off just with a brief introduction to pensions funding, and then myself and Ian will come on to discuss the approach that we'll take to the contribution investment strategy review. And this exercise is actually just the first part of the 2022 actuarial valuation and investment strategy reviews. You will likely see a lot more from us over the course of the next year or so, as we go through the rest of those processes. So we'll conclude today's training session just with a bit of an overview of what is to come. We're happy to take questions as we go through the presentation, or of course take them at the end. Please do raise your hand, and if someone can let me know if someone has raised a hand, just because I can only see my own slides on the screen at the moment, so please do just jump in. So we'll start then with the introduction to pensions funding. So before we get into the detail, it is worth just taking a step back to remind ourselves at a very high level of how this pension fund works. At its very core, this fund does three things. It collects contributions from the employers and participating employees in the fund. It invests those contributions to generate investment income, which we hope will be positive over the long term. And it uses both of these things to then pay benefits that have been promised to your members. And the level of those benefits are set out in the Lgps regulations. So the fund has no control over the level of those benefits. So it's very important that the contribution and investment strategies are carefully considered and regularly monitored to ensure that there are sufficient assets to meet those promised benefits when they fall due. One of the things that I'll report to you when we carry out the actuarial valuation is the fund's funding level, and that is the ratio of the assets held today to the value of the benefits that has been promised to members to date. A lot of people like to put a lot of focus on that metric, and I can see why. To be fair, it's quite easy to understand, it's easy to calculate and to track progress against, and it is certainly useful for understanding how financial markets are impacting the cost of these benefits over time. But the funding level isn't the ultimate objective of the fund. Reaching 100% funded, which the fund may very well have done at this particular moment in time. So for the avoidance of doubt, the picture on the screen here is not, it's a generalised picture, it's not expected to show the Hackney funding position today. The fund may very well today have an asset value that is equal to the value of benefits, making it 100% funded. But that unfortunately doesn't mean that we can, crack open the champagne and congratulate ourselves on a job well done. And one of the main reasons for that is that the Lgps, which this fund participates in, is open to both future benefit accrual for existing members and open to new members. So we don't only have to worry about those benefits that have been earned to date, we also need to worry about all of those benefits that will continue to be earned in the future every day by members in this fund. And that is the objective of the fund, is to meet both those benefits. And to meet these benefits, we rely on the future contributions and the future investment performance. And the key funding decision is how we balance these two things. On the one hand, you could set a very risky investment strategy from which you might expect to receive a higher investment return. So looking on the right-hand side here, you might set something which you think the dark orange bar will meet the majority of all the costs of these benefits. And that in turn would mean that the contribution level doesn't have to be so high. We could set a low contribution rate. We would call that a high risk strategy because those investment returns are of course very uncertain and may not materialise. Alternatively, you could set a low risk strategy whereby the contributions are set at a very high level. So the pale yellow box there is the larger one. And in that case, you wouldn't need to rely quite so much on the future investment performance. And you could adopt a fairly conservative investment strategy. The question then is, can the employers in the fund afford it? Probably not. So the key fund decision is how we balance the contributions and future investment performance. And it's all about getting the right balance. The end game is actually a balance between an affordable level of ongoing contributions for the employers and an appropriate level of investment risk and therefore target return. So that's the objective. Are there any questions on that before we move on to how we then do this?
Ben Hayhurst had a question.
Thank you, Chair. I mean, just we might be coming on to this, but
Ben?
is there a general benchmarking amongst the other local authorities as to what that balance is between those two, between how much they rely upon contributions versus investment? So, in other words, other people in our area.
No, there isn't a benchmark. It's hopefully the modelling will provide you. We'll come on to show you. We'll come on to explain what the modelling will show you. But there isn't a benchmark in terms of what contribution rate should be paid over the long term. It really is just what is. It's more about understanding, given a particular level of contributions, what is the level of risk that we're taking on, in terms of what is the likelihood that will actually deliver our long-term objectives of being able to meet all those benefits. That is really what the modelling will help you gather an appreciation of. But no, there isn't a benchmark as such on that. It's really just about making decisions in an informed way. Hopefully when we come on to speak about it, that'll become clear, hopefully. Any further questions?
Laura, you're cutting out for quite a lot of that. I don't know if it's directional mic or what. Anyway, Ben, did you get what you wanted out of that question?
Yes, thank you, Chair.
Yeah.
Okay then, we'll carry on.
Do just let me know if the connection is failing. Apologies for that. So we'll move on now just to talk about the actual approach then to this contribution and investment strategy review. In times gone by, we would have taken quite a simplistic approach to the funding strategy review. What we would have done is we would have estimated how much assets we think need to be held in the future in, say, 20 years' time by placing a single value on the benefits that we think will have been accrued by then. So this is the value that you see on the right-hand side of the screen there, the pink box on the right-hand side. Now, the pension benefits in this fund are linked to future inflation. And so to place a value on these benefits, in times gone by, we would have made a single assumption about what we think future inflation would be, say 3% per annum in all future years. In deciding how we're going to get from the assets held today to the assets that we think need to be held in the future, in 20 or so years' time, say, again, we would have made a single assumption about what investment returns that we would get, say something like 5% per annum in all future years. And from this quite simple analysis, we would then be able to deduce what the contributions need to be for the next 20 years to get us from point A today to point B, and what we would have assumed is a straight line. In other words, we would assume that financial markets are predictable, and would be putting all of our eggs in one basket and making these single assumptions about the future. But what if investment returns don't behave exactly as we expect? I'm sure we all know from previous experience that they don't perform the same amount each year, and they do tend to go up and down. What if the fund wishes to change its investment strategy, and we want to explore how that impacts things in the future? Or indeed, what if those inflation-linked benefits cost more or less than that single assumption that we made? In this instance, we would say that what if the reality is not what we assumed, not if the reality is not what our expectation was, we may have found ourselves with some broken eggs. Or really, for if you're an employer participating in this fund, what that potentially would have mean is an unexpected hike in the contribution rate that we would ask you to pay at the next review. So that's something that we want to avoid clearly. Thankfully, nowadays, with the computing power that is available to us today, we can do something that is a little more sophisticated. So instead of projecting just one version of the future, we test different contribution and investment strategies under several, 5,000 in fact, possible versions of the future. And we see how this funding level develops in each of those 5,000 projections. Each of the simulation allows for a different path for each of these economic variables that I've been talking about: future inflation, future investment returns. And why we do this is because what we're saying is we can't be certain about what the future will bring, but by analysing a range, a very full range of possible outcomes, we can then answer questions like, how likely is it that this investment strategy, or sorry, this funding strategy will work? And how bad could things get if things don't go to plan? I'll pass over to Ian to explain how it is that we do that, but happy again to take any questions on what I've covered so far.
Are there any questions on what we've covered so far? That slide we're showing there is actually quite, well, they're all key, but that one is quite fundamental to the way that we work out the sort of position on the fund. Shall we move on then? Oh, Cam Adams, Councillor Adams.
Yes, it's just a matter of, I'm just interested in how you determine the level of inflation in your modeling. If you can just share some light on that.
Sure. So, like I say, we don't allow for one single version of what future inflation will look like. We allow for 5,000 different projections of what that will be. And to do that, we rely on a service at Hyman Robertson called our Economic Scenario Service, which is the sort of economists and quantitative analysis that we have at Hyman Robertson. They inform that by looking at various different things, including how financial markets are performing at the moment, what markets data is suggesting the future performance might look like, and obviously Bank of England targets and things like that. But the key thing is that we don't just make one single assumption about it. We allow for a whole range of what might expect. Some scenarios quite unlikely, some scenarios quite likely. But by allowing for a full distribution, we can build up a better picture, really, than just looking at one. Does that answer your question?
Thank you. Yes, thanks.
Thank you.
Okay. So the key thing from what I've covered
Okay,
is that
do you
we're not
want-
putting all our eggs in one basket. We're putting our eggs in several baskets in order to ensure a full range of coverage. I'll pass over to Ian now just to explain what kind of different things we do when we look at the modelling.
Okay, thank you. If you could just, yeah, thank you. Okay, so then you need to decide what it is that you're going to model. So what are you going to plug into that clever tool that gives you all wiggly lines? What funding strategies do you want to consider for the fund going forward in order to kind of achieve and sustain full funding? And here there are two levers that you can pull as shown on the slide, investment strategy and contributions. So for investment strategy, you are essentially looking at what level of return do you want to target and what level of risk are you willing to take. And then on contributions, as you would guess, it's how much you're going to charge your employers. Are you going to increase or decrease compared to what you're at now? And the two are, of course, interlinked, as Laura mentioned before. The higher return you earn on your investments, the less you need to charge employees and contributions. However, if thought about the other way, the higher the contributions you charge, the less investment risk you need to take. And of course, if you take lots of investment risk, then there's a higher likelihood of the investment strategy going very wrong and contribution rates needing to go up anyway. So it's important to find the correct balance, and that's what this modelling is there to help you to do. So this then leads to you deciding on a range of strategies to model, combining increasing and decreasing investment risk and contribution rates, and doing so at different paces too. And this is set out on the slide by the 5 broad options for the 2 levers as set out. Now this can create a bit of a chicken and egg scenario. Do you reduce investment risk and see what impact that has on contributions, or do you set contributions and fit the investment strategy around that? Or do you try a bit of both? In most cases, typically the contribution rates would be decided first. This would be based on what is viewed as affordable for the employers. For example, if you wanted more confidence that you would be fully funded at a point in the future, but don't believe you can afford to charge higher contribution rates, you would need to fix your contributions and try and alter your investment strategy around that to fill the gap. And what you may see from the green shading on the slide, we've elected to model a strategy based on this example fund's current investment strategy and current contribution rates, which is shown on the next slide. So here you can see the main outputs that come from our modelling or that we would share with you. So the chart on the left shows the potential range of funding levels that could happen over time. It's another way of looking at that chart with the wiggly lines. So you'd see what are the potential range of funding levels that could happen, ranging from the very good at the top of this blue funnel to the very bad at the bottom, but with a central range of more likely outcomes in the middle in the lighter blue. And the pink line across the funnel shows the funding level of 100%. But the chart on the right contains the particularly helpful information. So this shows 2 key metrics for a funding strategy. The first is what we call likelihood of success, which means the likelihood of the fund being at least 100% funded at a certain target date in the future. So for the chart on the left, that shows a proportion of the outcomes of funding levels that are above that pink 100% funding line at your target date. And on this chart on the right, that shows that about 75% of the outcomes are above 100% or at least 100% at your target date. The other metric shown is a measure of downside risk, and this shows what the funding level could fall to in particularly bad scenarios. So again, for the chart on the left, it takes the bottom, say 5% of funding levels, finds the average of those under this bad scenario, what could your funding level fall to? So these combine to show you both kind of positive and negative aspects of your funding strategy, and are an outcome of the expected return of your investment strategy, the level of risk in that strategy, and also the contribution rates. It looks like we have a question from Jonathan.
A question for Jonathan there.
You're on mute, Jonathan.
You are muted this time, Jonathan.
Is that better? Can you
Yes.
hear me? Okay. Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Ian. Ian, your comments just then about varying the contribution strategy reminds me that last year, that dark year of 2020, when we had a real slump in markets, I suggested, I think it was in April or possibly early May, that we accelerate contributions. We take advantage of the dip. What actually happened?
That is a very good question. Laura, you look like you've an
One
answer.
for me as well. Yeah, so we wouldn't tend to react to short-term market movements in that way. So yeah, you're right. Markets did take a dip at the beginning of 2020 for obvious reasons. And at that point in time, you know, we wouldn't typically say let's react to this short-term thing, because when we fund this pension fund, we're taking a long-term view. Markets have recovered since then, in fact, more so than that dip. So actually, if you look at the performance of the investments today, we're actually at a better position than what we were 3 years ago, even having taken account of that temporary dip. So that shows that it was probably the right thing to do, just to hold fire and to continue with what is a long-term funding strategy, rather than one that chops and changes depending on what markets are doing on a particular day.
Jonathan.
Thank you, Chair. Laura, I understand, but come on, folks. This was a real one-off. And I mean, what does this mean about Ian's earlier comments about short-term increases and also decreases, but increases is what I'm looking at, short-term increases in contributions? Come on, guys.
For the avoidance of doubt, what we showed on the previous slide, again, this is not what we are modelling for this fund. We are still working with fund officers to determine the precise investment strategies and contribution patterns that we will model. The purpose of this slide is really just to show in general terms the kind of things that you can look at in the modelling. But for the avoidance of doubt, we've not done the modelling yet, and the results that you see here are very much sample results. They're not intended to be the results of the Hackney pension fund. Those are the results that we will be bringing back to this committee in March next year.
Okay. So as was
Okay, Jonathan, can we move on now? Can we move on now, Jonathan? Yeah, you're right. Okay.
Okay.
Look, Ian, is it back?
Yes, thank you. So just to finish up with this slide, as a reminder, these metrics combine to show you both positive and negative aspects of a funding strategy. They take into account the expected return, the risk, and also the contribution rates. And it's really all about, again, comparing a number of different strategies to find what is the best balance of likelihood of success versus downside risk, kind of risk versus return, and trying to find the solution that's most suitable to you. So you run numerous different combinations of investment strategies and contribution rates to find what is optimal for you. And if we just flick onto the next page, this shows that the modelling then leads you to seeing what combinations would potentially be most suitable for you and which may not work together. For example, as shown on this slide, if you had a preference to reduce the investment risk because you felt it was running too high, this may mean that there's no scope to consider reductions in contribution rates. As the model may show that the likelihood of success measure here is just far too low to be comfortable for you, so you wouldn't want to accept this. So again, this modelling is just used to find the correct balance between these two levers that you can pull. So that's all we had on the approach. If there are any other questions before Laura takes us on.
And yeah, just for the pointed out, this is just
I don't see any.
a sample.
Yeah.
This is not what we're proposing is the case for the Hackney Fund. This is just how the modelling works at this stage.
Sorry, Ben Hayhurst, Councillor Hayhurst.
Thanks, Chair. Ian, I'm just wondering, I might not phrase this correctly. I'm just wondering how we get from the stage whereby you've got the 5,000 models and you've got a case wherein 75% of those you're where you want to be to fully funded. How do you get from that stage to say what is your minimum employer contribution? Because presumably some of those 75 would have varying degrees of employer contributions. So I don't quite understand how the algorithm then converts that to the figures, as it were, on employer contribution or investment risk. Does that make sense?
Yes, no, of course. So what these two metrics that will show you these metrics for each combination of investment strategy and contribution pattern that we've modelled. So from the previous slide here, if you were just wanting to say, I want to keep things exactly as they are, let's only look at the current investment strategy and keep the contribution pattern steady, we would say that's, for example, that's strategy 3C. So we would show you results for strategy 3C, and these will be the main metrics that we'll look at when we're looking at these results. We will show you these. We will show you these results for all of the strategies that you model, whether that includes little bits of contribution decreases or investment strategy reductions. All the different combinations that we'll look at, we'll show you these two metrics for all of them. So it'll be for this fund to decide, based on the results of that modelling, to compare and contrast the different strategies to say, well, actually, these strategies work because we're, happy that when things go to plan, there's a good likelihood that the strategy will work. However, you might pick one strategy over another because the downside risk is better. So it'll be about setting what is the fund's preferences and what is the level of risk that you're happy to take, and then comparing the different combinations of strategies based on those metrics.
So in other words, the 5,000 is run against the models are run against various different scenarios.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
I'm with it. Yeah. And then you, fine, I'm with it.
So we're not just running it once 5,000 times. We're running it several times 5,000 times. Yeah, that's exactly right.
Got it.
Yeah. Any more questions on the modelling then before we just discuss briefly what will be involved in the rest of the process as we've moved through the valuation and investment strategy reviews?
I don't see any, so.
Okay, perfect. We'll move on. In that case, let's look at what's to come. This, again, we're still, things might change as we go through the process, and you might decide that you want to spend a bit more time on something or a bit less on others. But the plan that we've proposed to fund officers at the moment is set out on the screen now. So at the moment, we are currently in the process of we're carrying out some data cleansing on the fund's data. And we can bring that report on that data quality back to this committee in January. We would also propose to have a look at the assumptions proposals for the actuarial valuation around that time as well. Then in March, we should be in a position to come back to you all with the results of this modelling that we've been talking about today, and setting out the council's contribution rate proposals, and also the high level investment strategy considerations. And as we move on through the year, we'll then need to turn our focus to the other employers in the fund. So as we move on through the rest of the year, we can provide, again, we can then start to discuss employer funding strategies for the other employers in the fund, and also go into more of the nuts and bolts of the investment strategy review. Round about September next year, we should be in a position to be able to report back the whole fund's funding level. But as I say, this is not the most important outcome of the valuation, but it is something that we do have to report to you, and it does have its uses, so we'll report that back to you. But the key thing that we'll be doing towards the end of summer next year will be reviewing the fund's funding strategy statement. That is, in effect, the rule book that we use to determine whether or not, or to determine the contribution rates for all of the employers in this fund. So we would ask you to sign off on that rule book, on that funding strategy statement, and that will allow us to go ahead then and consult with employers on their funding strategy. At that point in time, we'll also be looking, or Ian and Andrew and their team will be looking at the implementation of the investment strategy that has been decided as part of this review. And then we'll ask you probably towards this time next year to just approve any of those changes to funding strategies that we have, and we'll give you an update on the employer consultation process and what the feedback has been from employers before finally concluding all of the exercise for the actuarial valuation in March of 2023, where we'll sign off the final valuation report and final funding strategy statement, thereby allowing for employer contribution rates to change with effect from 1st of April 2023. So that's everything that we have to do over the course of the next year and a bit. So as I say, you'll be probably seeing more of me, more of Ian and Andrew, but happy to take any questions that you have at this stage in relation to the valuation or investment strategy review.
Okay, are there any further questions or comments on it? Councillor Hayhurst again.
Thanks, Rob. Just quickly, Laura, could you just recap what is the current contribution rate of the council? And maybe for every point of that, however it's defined, how much less would the council have to put in sort of every year? Is it sort of for every point, is it 500,000 or 1 million? Just to give us an overall framework about what we're looking at.
Contribution rate is 30% at the moment. That's been in a bit of a downward trajectory for a number of years now. In terms of the actual amount, I would need to probably have a look at that. I don't know if Michael knows off the top of your head, Michael.
I'm looking at Jackie.
That would be between 850 and 900k in terms of 1%. It's between 850 and 900k for each percentage point.
Okay. Thank you. Are there any? Sorry, I'm not getting the coordination of this microphone very well. But are there any other questions or comments? Councillor Spence.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. I wanted to ask about contributions, and I mean, are there any sort of early indications at this point about whether it's likely that contributions might have to go up, or not, or are we simply not to that point where we can talk in those terms? I'm partly saying that in the context of what's happened, I guess, the last 10 years under the cuts that local government have faced, and I guess the workforce has shrunk to a degree, which means the number of people contributing to the fund will have fallen over a period of time, and the extent to which that may be impacting on the contributions that the remaining workforce have to make to maintain the fund. That's my question.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think I probably
Thank you.
I'm going to defer that question just because I think it is.
Sorry, Ian Williams wants to come in, so can I ask Ian first? Yeah.
Can everyone hear me okay? Splendid. So absolutely, very good question, Councillor Spence. I think what I would say on this is, of course, whilst Hackney has been on the journey with austerity, which we're all familiar with in terms of the reductions, what we have done at the same time is a very active and extensive programme of insourcing as well. So whereas over this period, a lot of councils will have outsourced services from internal audit, ICT, actually what we've done is insourced. So what we've been seeing is actually relatively a transition of our workforce from being a combination of in-house, outsourced, different models to actually bringing more people onto the council's books, more into our payroll, for want of a better word, and then obviously more being able to access the Lgps. And what I would say, and particularly with Councillor Chapman as chair, we were one of the most active funds in taking forward auto enrolment. So when that came forwards, we did extensive pieces of work, not to give advice because we're not allowed to, but what we did make sure members, officers were aware of was the real benefits of joining the Lgps. Michael, previous colleagues of ours, Julie Stacey, did a series of workshops across the council over many weeks and months to really make sure we got a really good take-up of colleagues to join the scheme through the auto enrolment process. So what we have seen, and I think we're probably one of the healthier funds in terms of actively positive cash flow. So it's something which we look to actively take forwards. Hopefully that answers your point.
Thank you. All right. Okay. Are there any other questions or comments on this training session? Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. I've been through this exercise a couple of times, and others are brand new to it. So, if there are any further questions or issues that you want to raise on it, I'll ask members if they contact the officers, we can arrange for additional briefing or whatever you need to understand it, because it is one of the more important things that we do on the 3-year cycle. Okay, so if I can thank Laura and Jonathan, you wanted to make a comment for? Oh, he's agreeing with me. Great. Okay, so if I can thank Laura and Ian very much for that, and if we can now move on to item 5, the annual report and accounts. I think Michael Hanneset's going to introduce it.
Yeah, so this is the annual report and accounts of the pension fund for the year ended 31st of March 21. Whilst it is a huge document, I think committee members will recognise that much of it you would have seen throughout the year through quarterly update reports, etc. And obviously some of the policies and strategies that are included in there are a requirement of the regulations around the structure of the report. I think the main things that members won't have seen is obviously the introduction, which actually points to a couple of things, particularly around returns on assets this year. So in response to something that Jonathan raised earlier, the fund actually returned overall 25.6% over the year, which is slightly ahead of the average for LGPS funds as well. So very good year. And a recovery or more than a recovery, increase in the value of the assets from just under 1.5 billion to 1.86 billion pounds. So a very positive year, even though recovering from the pandemic and things like that. And it sets out also at the funding level as at the 31st of March, and as we've already said, it goes up and down depending on market conditions, etc. But it was at 102% at the end of March. I think the other major element of this document we won't have seen is obviously the actual accounts, which I've already referred to in terms of the headline figures. I think the other headline figure from that is that the fund remained cash flow positive, and it was to a healthy sum of about 90 million after returns on investment income. I think one thing to note really is that usually we would be publishing a final audited annual report and accounts. That's not possible this year because the audit hasn't started yet. However, that is due to start at the beginning of December. I think this report actually says January, but it is actually, they're bringing it forward to the beginning of December. So we will be publishing a pre-audit version, and then obviously if there are any changes during the audit, which I wouldn't expect there to be, but you can never tell, we would obviously update in the final version, and we'd let committee know of any changes therein. I think that's all I'm going to really say. It's over for any questions.
Thank you very much. Well, what I didn't do at the beginning was to ask for introductions. But recognition we've got new members here. Michael, do you want to just quickly introduce yourself? Sorry.
Sorry, I'm Michael Hanneset. I'm the interim head of pensions.
Thank you. So, if there are any questions or comments on the draft accounts and audit, I just want to say, I mean, can I commend the document first of all, and I recommend that anyone who wants to know anything about Hackney's pension fund, it's as good a place to look as anywhere, and I think you'll find almost most things in it. And I can't pass on without saying it's obviously been an exceptional year, isn't it? Not without all the issues with COVID and the challenges that places both to our members and the staff. And you know, on top of that, we've actually achieved a very, very good result, both in terms of the financial result of the fund and in terms of all the other activities that we've been pursuing and our responsible investment activities, a large-scale restructuring of the fund, and it's been a really good year. And thank you everyone involved in all that work. Okay, has anyone finally got any questions or comments on that? I don't see any. So I notice it says note this version of the pension fund annual reports and accounts. I suppose that doesn't mean there's loads of others floating around, but there are. Sorry, Ian Williams.
No, I think just to build upon your comments, if it's okay, Chair, obviously really welcome those and absolutely full credit to the team, but I also think it's also appropriate to put on record the fact that we work closely with yourself as Chair of the committee and committee members over this year as well. It hasn't, as you've clarified, not been the easiest of years, but it's been a really strong year for the pension fund in totality. So I think that should also be recognised in the way it's recorded.
That's very kind of you. I must add, but I didn't add our advice head officers, but I didn't say officers and advisors. It's a real team, and thanks to everybody. Okay, and so we note this version of the pension fund report and accounts and approved publication of the draft set out in item 5, page 1. Can we note the accounts and approve publication? Yep, I take that as agreement. So
noted and agreed.
Good, thank you. So if we could move on to item 6 for knowledge and skills policy. Have I missed something?
Karen is going to introduce this.
Oh, Karen,
report.
my apologies.
Thank you, Chair. For those of you who are new, I'm Karen McWilliam from Aon, and I'm the Governance and Benefits Advisor to the Pension Fund. So item 6 is the updated knowledge and skills policy for the pension fund. It used to be called the training policy, but we're now recognising that some people don't need training because they already do have appropriate knowledge and skills. The policy was originally introduced in 2015 and is typically refreshed every 3 years. However, this refresh we've actually aligned with some quite big movements of central guidance. So first of all, there's been a scheme advisory board good governance project, which has tried to elevate the importance of knowledge and skills of committee members, and particularly also the Section 151 officer of pension funds. And secondly, also SITFA have produced a new code and also a framework around the knowledge and skills of those involved in the management of the pension fund, and again, particularly focused on pension committee members and also senior officers in the fund. So we held off until those publications came out so that we could actually ensure this encompassed the expectations within those publications. It's also worth highlighting that there are other requirements. For example, I won't go into the details, but MiFID II places a lot of requirements on you as a pension committee to have appropriate knowledge and skills. And if you don't actually meet those requirements, then a lot of what Ian was talking about, the different types of investments, you wouldn't actually be able to do. So there are other underlying legal and also professional standards that we need to incorporate in delivering this policy. So I'd probably just draw a couple of bits of the amended policy to your attention. First of all, on page 3 of the appendix, I appreciate it's a bit difficult because some people are working with virtual copies and some people are working on hard copies. But, and I'll summarise these points for you. But on page 3 of the appendix, there are 3 quite explicit objectives in the policy. The first one is around ensuring those that are managing the fund have the appropriate knowledge and skills, and particularly in the continually changing local government pension scheme and wider pensions landscape. And secondly, ensuring that those people have the appropriate knowledge and skills to be able to challenge the advice that they receive. So you don't just sit and take what myself and Laura and Ian tell you, but you actually think about, do you know, are they talking any sense here? And the officers, of course. And the third one is that people responsible for the management and governance of the fund are committed to attending and engaging with the suggested training in accordance with the knowledge and skills. So that's the 3 objectives we've incorporated here. On page 4 of the actual policy, we've also tried to better articulate the expectations in relation to committee members and your role as a committee member. So SITFA's guidance is quite useful now in that it does clarify that it's about having the appropriate knowledge and skills of the committee as a collective. So each of you individually do not need to be well and truly aware of every part of what we're talking about, but as a collective we need to feel quite assured that together you've got the appropriate knowledge and skills to be able to make decisions and also challenge the officers and advisors. And the last bit I just want to highlight is on page 12 of the policy, where it talks about how we're going to measure whether we're actually achieving the objectives of the policy. And we'll do that in a few ways. First of all, an individual training needs analysis of some sort will be carried out at least every 2 years so that you get the opportunity to highlight if you think you're needing some further training in any areas. But also we'll be measuring attendance at, for example, if we put on as a fund some specific training, like Laura's training today on the valuation, we're trying to ensure that at least 75% of the committee members are actually attending events such as that, and also that you as committee members try to actually think about opportunities for wider training, and up to about a day a year is what we're suggesting there. And it doesn't need to be a full day at a conference or event. It could be a couple of virtual events, which could be an hour a piece sort of thing. So again, we're putting a bit of a benchmark in there of at least a day a year and sort of general awareness training. And in future meetings, we'll be able to highlight to you any such events as they become available. So the committee are being asked to approve the amended policy, Chair, but I'm open to take any further questions.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions or comments on this item? No, can I just say thank you for the report? I mean, one of the characteristics of the Pensions Committee is that, you know, there's quite, I won't say a high training requirement, but there's a significant training requirement. All members as well as their officers and advisors. So it's really helpful sort of the policy, I think, to be a lot clearer than I think as we previously stated this. That's very useful. Just to note that it strikes me that in agreeing the policy, I mean, we're doing quite a lot of this already, but there are a few things that we're going to have to do as a result of it, and as they're setting out. So I think in agreeing that we should note that as well. But there. So if I still see no hands, if we can then agree. Sorry, wrong page. What we asked to do? We asked to note the. I've not got that one.
Approve the update.
Okay, sorry. Yes, to approve the updated knowledge and skills policy as set out in Appendix 1. Can we do that?
Approved.
Thank you very much indeed. We are scheduled, I think, to have. Let's go to the next item and then see how we get on and have a break after that. So if we can now do the tenders update, it's item 7.
Okay, so excuse me. This report just sets out the current position in terms of a number of tenders that are due to come up. Most of the contracts for advisors and some of the other services were extended during the pandemic, largely because of, well, obviously because the situation at the time, but also because of some of the Lgps frameworks that we use to actually tender those services were not renewed or were coming up for renewal but were delayed themselves. So a number of these contracts were originally extended for a year up to the end of October this year, and we was hoping that we would have obviously gone through and re-tendered the process in that time. Unfortunately, some of the frameworks weren't quite ready at the time, and other issues have meant that we haven't been able to actually complete or start some of those tenders. So we're asking in this report for an extension on 3 of the contracts for 6 months, which will allow us to actually use the new national LGPS frameworks to actually tender these properly and efficiently. So those are the services for investment consultancy and the actuarial services contract. And also we've got the benefits and governance consultancy contract, again, which we're asking for an extension to the end of April so that we can go throughout the process. Alongside that, your committee agreed back in, I'm just trying to remember when it was now actually, March of this year, that the custodian services contract would be extended for a year. So that takes us through to March next year. We are still on track to actually retender that within the time. Again, we was waiting for the Lgps framework, which has been refreshed, to be renewed. It now has. And I've actually only today, we're just signing off on the actual paperwork from the Lgps framework so that we can actually move ahead with that tender. I fully expect that to be completed within the time that was already agreed. And then we've got another one which really has come out of the revised investment strategy, where previously our foreign currency hedging was part of their previous mandates. It was provided as part of that. We've moved out, as you know, we've transitioned across to some new mandates within the LCIV, and that hedging isn't available within the mandates we have. And committee agreed at the time we set the strategy that we would continue to hit 30%, but we need to get a new revised contract for that. There has been some work around that in terms of market research, etc. And because of the value and of that contract is relatively low, and it's the risk attached to it is also deemed to be low. So that will go, in terms of the council's procurement process, that will go through, we're just doing the business case at the moment, and that will be subject to officer approval in line with the procurement process. Obviously, we will come to committee and actually tell you who it is that we're approving, awarding the contract to, but it is just to make sure, obviously, the committee's decision to hedge at 30% is implemented. So that's in process at the moment. So really, this paper is just setting out the current position and asking for those extensions so that we can complete the procurements by the end of April.
Thank you. Well, I've got a number of hands. So Ben, Councillor Hayhurst, and then Henry Colthurst. Councillor Hayhurst.
Just a plea, please, on training. Maybe when the hedging comes back, can we just have a 10-minute training session on it, just to fully understand how it works? I still haven't quite got my head around it on a personal level.
Did you get that?
Sorry, I didn't hear the question.
Yeah, could you say that again, Ben? Sorry.
Yeah, sorry.
Perhaps slower. The mics, the sound system isn't very good tonight.
When the hedging tender comes back, is there any chance we can just have a 10-minute or maybe 15-minute training session on hedging and how it works? Because speaking personally, I still haven't quite got to grips with it.
Yep, that's not a problem. We can arrange that, definitely. Yep.
It's a good idea. Henry.
Thank you. I'll go slightly further than that. As you know, I'm pretty sceptical of the value of hedging in a diversified portfolio anyhow. So I'd quite like to see a training before we actually sign up with a new contract provider on that, because I'm really unconvinced about the value of hedging on a portfolio of this size. So that's my position there. My second point was, we've seen an awful lot of tenders coming up for renewal at the same time or being extended at the same time. So I just wondered if consideration might be given to some sort of staggering of the expiry dates so that they don't all pile up onto the same date in 3 years' time, which must be quite a lot of work for officers.
Yeah, I don't think we can stagger the dates to any further in terms of these extensions, but what we can do is make within most of the frameworks that you usually take a contract for 3 years or so, and then there's option to extend for further 1 or 2 years, and we can use that to make sure they get staggered in the future back out. However, there are a couple of the tenders which are usually good to try and do together, and that's usually what we've done in the past, is try to do the investment consultancy and actuarial, not necessarily to the same people, but the tenders at the same time, because as you saw from the training tonight, they are very much interlinked, some of those. In terms of the hedging, I don't know if the chair was going to say, but obviously that decision was made back in March, that the 30% hedging, so that is a committee decision that's already been made.
If you recall, Henry, we did have a discussion before where we did incorporate a new policy into the investment strategy. I think I've got the right strategy there. Anyway, we did agree it. And if you remember, it's also at a reduced level than we were 50% hedged currently. And I think we said we're going to I think we said we were going to move to a third. Yeah.
Okay. Well, it may be, Rob, that the training session should include a bit on why we think this renewed contract is going to give us value, because I just think it's going to provide more complexity. Therefore, that's only from my perspective. I just think by going into a massive hedging strategy, we're running up fees and complexity, which we probably can avoid. So if we agree the 30%, fine. But I think that whoever the provider is needs to be able to explain why they're going to be giving value for whatever fee they're offering.
Okay, we know that. Okay, are there any other questions or comments? Can I just talk about member involvement? I think, because some of us will recall that we were very disappointed when we let the admin contract that we weren't members weren't enabled to have effective involvement in the choice, and these contracts obviously are very, I'll say very personal to the committee. I'm not sure personal is quite the right word, but obviously there's a very close engagement between these advisors who, are fundamental to what we do in terms of our investment and administrative strategies. So I wouldn't like that to happen. The same thing happened when we appointed Equinity, in terms of basically we set a process up which effectively led us to having to just rubber stamp a decision. But obviously it needs to be a real decision by the committee this time, and we need to facilitate whatever we need to do that.
Yeah, I think what we need to make sure is that within the tender documents, etc., the scoring includes an element of interaction with the committee, which wasn't included in that administration procurement. And then we can run that process whereby the contractors that actually tender for the contract can come to committee and present to you, and we'd be part of the scoring for that overall award.
Yeah, I'd say the element needs to allow us to make a choice, if that's appropriate. And obviously the meetings will need to be arranged to do that, and that's been difficult, isn't it? Because if it's going to be committee interviews, which is, I think probably it should be, well, it should be. We'll need to obviously fix special meeting for that as well. And we've also commented, haven't we, that there may be issues with the March date as it is of the committee, so there's quite a lot of stuff to be rescheduled.
Yes, indeed. I know we're looking for a new March date earlier in March. I believe the January one might need to be changed as well, I heard tonight, which I wasn't aware of till this evening, but we need to get those done, and the workshops. We've got another workshop we need to schedule for responsible investment work, and obviously for this procurement work as well. So yeah, quite a busy period, definitely.
Yeah, there's a bit of an issue with pension committee meetings, I'll just say for members here, because when some years ago a decision was taken to reschedule a number of committee meetings generally across the council, we went down from about 8 or 10 to 4. officially, but the amount of work didn't. So, which is why we sometimes have very long meetings, why we have to have special meetings like this. And it'd be just as well, if we could, to schedule whatever additional things we need in as soon as possible. Yeah. Okay. Are there any other, sorry, on the, oh yeah, Henry wants to come back.
Yeah, sorry, just on that point, if we're going to change these dates, please can we give us advance warning, because it's a nightmare with other commitments to try and make these change meetings again. So I really do, please try and get them in the diary and stick with them. I do understand that everybody's busy, but it's really, really difficult. Thank you.
I second that. So if we could, as soon as possible, identify, within a week or so, if possible, what additional we need to do, and then start the process of when we're going to do it. Because as Henry said, if it is a bit, inevitably, I mean, Henry, I'm afraid inevitably things happen, and I wouldn't for a moment blame anyone for it. But if we could do it as early as possible, that would be really, really helpful, so we can get an idea what the commitments are. Like as you said, there's other things we need to schedule as well. The button. So if we can. So to approve the extension to the investment consultancy and Hyams Robertson and the actuarial and investment advice contract. Sorry, I'll just try to read the recommendation there, make sense of that. And then approve the extension of the benefits and governance consultancy contract, and note the current position regarding services contract and the current position regarding currency hedging services as set out on page 1 of the item. Can we agree on that?
Approved and noted.
I'm suggesting now we have a short break of 5 minutes. Is that all right? So if we come back here at just after 1:45, 14 minutes to or something, and start around then. Is that all right? Thank you very much. Okay. Okay then, if we can start, we're still live streaming, I see, so the live streaming's on. So item 8, CMA investment management objectives. I believe this is Michael again, yeah?
So I think, well, some members will remember last year we actually brought objectives to the committee at the same time as we was doing the state. We have to do an annual statement or return to FCA, which actually says that we've considered, if you like, the quality of the investment advice we've received, etc. And you set some objectives to measure that against. Clearly, what we need to do is set those objectives first. So the ones here are actually based largely around last year's, but we've done quite a bit of work looking at what other funds actually have within their own objectives as well, to make sure we're relevant and splitting them across different areas of the advice that we receive from our investment consultancy. So around the strategy itself, around monitoring and performance, and then compliance and regulation itself, and also the actual relationship that we have with the consultants have with both officers and members. So there's a set of objectives here, which is I'm obviously happy to take comment on and amend as appropriate if committee agree to. I think the important thing is the process around this is once we've set these objectives this evening, at the next committee in January, we will actually be considering the return. So that will actually, the investment consultants, Hymans, will give us their thoughts around how they've fulfilled these objectives. And obviously officers and members will actually look to see whether they agree with that. And then we need to do that return to FCA. It's actually by the 7th of January usually, but obviously we haven't got a committee until later in January. So we'll actually get an extension a short extension from, sorry, it's the Competition and Markets Authority. I keep saying FCA, it's CMA, the Competition and Markets Authority. So we will get an extension from them just to make sure that we're covered by that. We never had an issue with doing that last year. I think as long as you get your return in and you've shown that you've done due process, they're quite happy with that. So really these objectives, the main reason for this evening is for you to consider the objectives are set out in the appendix, and to let me have any comments and any suggested changes that you might want to consider.
Okay then, I thought this was a useful clarification. So it's good to us, so thanks for that. Are there any questions or comments? Okay, in that case, oh, sorry, Patrick, Councillor Spence.
Chair, yeah. I was just looking at the table. I didn't really understand the right-hand column with comments as its heading, and then in italics these marks. Whose comments are these?
So that's really setting out what type of comments we will expect at the next committee. So obviously we've set out the funds requirements and what we're saying are the objectives for the investment advisor. When we come back to committee in January, we'll actually have the comments setting out how we think those objectives have been met, etc. And that's just giving an idea of what we'd expect to see around in those comments. So, yeah.
Henry. Henry? You're muted, Henry. Henry, you're muted.
Sorry. start again. The obvious one is to reduce the fund's exposure to fossil fuels by 2022, which is clearly almost time run out now. That clearly needs to be replaced with something. I suppose I would just like to see, I think that's now quite a simplistic target. Perhaps we should go more, we need to go more sustainable energy, I think, or something that doesn't just relate to fossil fuels, because I think it's now a much bigger picture. I'm not saying what it should be.
I think obviously that
Henry, you're breaking up a bit.
Okay, I was going to say I don't quite know what the measure should be, but it should no longer be just fossil fuels. I think it should be something geared to green and sustainable energy or something like that. But that's clearly a point for discussion in January.
Yeah, I've obviously that objective, that's the current target, and the objective in future will certainly be shaped by the work that we're doing around the responsible investment work and ESG over the next couple of months. So.
Any other comments or questions? In which case, can we agree and note as appropriate the recommendations on the page 1 of item 8? Okay, thank you very much. So it brings us on to item 9, the transition update, the investment strategy statement. Who's going to do this then? Are you going to start off and then Andrew or someone?
Yeah, I think Ian from Hymans is going to lead on this one.
Okay, Ian.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, on the transition,
our advisors, our investment advisors, Hymans Robson. Okay, Ian.
Okay, thank you. So just to set the scene on this transition that the fund's recently completed. So we've already discussed how back towards the end of 2020 and start of this year, we agreed a wide range of changes to the investment strategy. These had the benefit of a number of benefits for the fund, but mainly improving the diversification of the investment strategy and also increasing the proportion of the assets that are pooled, invested through the London CIV. We broke this planned change to the investment strategy down into a couple of phases, which was based on the prevalence of funds being available through the pool that were suitable. So phase 1 was designed to implement the changes that we could based on the products that are available now. And then phase 2 is looking at the funds that will be available in the long term. The transition completed phase 1 implementation as far as possible. Now I say as far as possible, as 2 parts of this phase we're investing in 2 illiquid funds, the London CIV Renewable Energy Infrastructure Fund and the London CIV Private Debt Fund. So because these are illiquid holdings, these will take time for all of the assets to be drawn down and invested into the funds. So right now the fund's asset allocation isn't exactly in line with the phase 1 allocation, but it is as far as possible, and the assets that were used to fund the remaining drawdowns have been earmarked, and there's a clear process to implement this. So this is a major step for the fund implementing the new strategy, and we'll continue to work with the London CIV to make it clear what we need from them in order to implement phase 2 as well. The transition meant moving nearly £500 million of assets, and it was done for a total explicit cost of just over £1 million, which is 0.22% of the assets moved, which is within reasonable expectations for a transition of this type and this size. And that is what the transition manager also reported, and it was within their initial estimates of what it could cost. So we're comfortable that this was largely appropriately managed by the transition manager. And then going forward, there are a number of next steps just to take a note from after this transition's been completed. So as we always do, we need to continue to monitor the fund's asset allocation to make sure it stays in line with the target. We need to continue to fund the 2 new illiquid holdings as and when they draw down capital and try to do that efficiently. and to continue to work with the London CIV to understand their product launch pipeline, but also make sure that they know what we want. We're not just accepting their products, we're keeping in contact with them to make sure they know what we need. The key areas here are finding a suitable replacement for potential bond mandates within the pool. Consider what pooled property solutions might become available. The pool are looking at what that might look like next year, but other pools have found pooling property very difficult, so that might be a longer term project. But also consider the London CIV's PEPA funds. This is an ESG and low carbon focused passive fund, which may offer a pooled alternative to our current low carbon passive fund that we have. It's launching very shortly. However, it's worth noting that this does include a number of exclusions which may jar with the committee's beliefs, so we would need to certainly review that. However, it's certainly one for consideration. So in summary, a major step towards the fund achieving its new target investment strategy and done so at a reasonable cost and managed in an appropriate way. So that was the transition.
Shall we do this in two parts then? Deal with the transition and then the investment strategy statement? Is that what? Yes. Okay. So then, any questions or comments on the transition part of the report? Yeah. Okay. Michael, Councillor Desmond.
Ian, I sat next to the Deputy Mayor of Bromley at the Bromley Civic Ball, and I told him how successful our pension fund was. And you know, they're very cocky in Bromley, and they were even more successful, which was rather irritating, but nevertheless, he is coming to our pantomime at the Hackney Empire, so obviously appreciated the camaraderie. What I wanted to ask, this all seems fine to me, are we at all monitoring the funds that the most successful London local authorities are investing in so that we get feedback on those investments?
So we at Hyman's
Sorry, Ian.
Sorry, is that a question for Hyman's Robertson, or is that a question for the officers? Sorry, I jumped in when it might not have been for me.
Yeah, I was going to pass it to Michael or Ian perhaps, but I know there is the Sit for Universe statistics produced annually, aren't they? I don't know if that will be relevant to that answer, but Michael anyway.
Yeah, I mean, we get the Sit for Universe, and we get obviously the PERC report as well, which gives us an indication of how the fund's done against other funds. And I'm sure that Hyman's as investment consultants will keep an eye on funds that are generally available as well. I'll leave Ian to comment on that more fully there.
Yeah, we research a very wide range of different investment products, so we're always up to date with kind of what are the best performing and what are the most suitable. We also advise a wide range of the London boroughs from an investment perspective as well, so we have a good sight of what's going well, what's successful, and what's less successful.
Okay, thanks.
So I think the short answer to that was yes. Okay, any other questions or comments? Again, if I could just comment on the immense amount of work here, and if you look at the table on page 290, that just shows the current state of our funds and where they're invested. Basically, we've now, my understanding, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is we've now more or less completed phase one, and we're now on to phase two. Mike, would you just...
That's correct. As Ian said, there are two of the funds, so the renewable and the private debt, are obviously subject to the actual drawdown of the capital, but we've committed to those, and as the drawdowns coming in, we are actually those assets are being paid across, but we've moved these funds as it sets out in this report.
Okay, yeah, and obviously the transition also reflects our as well as our investment ambitions to continue to have a high-performing fund. It also reflects our ambitions with, increasing our activity in relation to responsible investment and also our carbon reduction strategy. That's all right. So thank you all for that. So unless there's any comments or questions, I'll move on to the investment strategy bit. Is that Ian again?
Yes, no problem. So we have also, given the changes that you've made to your investment strategy, quite significant changes, we have also updated the investment strategy statement for the fund. So this is something this is a document that you have to maintain. You have to regularly review it and update it on a timely basis, but also after any significant changes to the fund. So this has just been updated to reflect the new investment strategy that you are now invested in, with the main update being to point 4.2.1 showing your new target fund allocation.
Any questions or comments? Okay, I've got one question. Sorry, I didn't give notice of this, but we've got further meetings on responsible investment, and I noticed we don't reflect out all the work that we did on values about a year ago now, maybe longer than a year ago in here. I just wonder how are we going to pick up on all that? Are we going to end up with a separate responsible investment strategy, or are we going to change the investment strategy again to incorporate that?
Okay, I think there will be a responsible investment policy, which we can incorporate within a refreshed investment strategy statement as well. So, yeah.
Any other questions or comments? In which case, can we get the right one? Transitions. So note the report, in part from the transitions report, and approve the interim investment strategy as set out in the first page of item 9. Can we do that? Thank you very much indeed. So that brings us to item 10, the annual benefit stations, pension saving statements and guaranteed minimum pension update. Thank you. So Cameron, you'll do that. Yeah.
I'll do that, yes. Thank you, Chair. So this report highlights 3 areas, 2 of which were covered at the last pension committee, and we promised to give you a further update on the progress in relation to those. So I'll start with those 2 areas first, which is the annual benefit statements and also the Gmp reconciliation work. So just to clarify, this is all work that is being done by Equinity as the third-party administrators to the fund, and it's been overseen by the officers of the fund, and we've had some involvement at Aon as well. So first of all, in relation to the annual benefit statements, you'll have heard at the last committee that a number of the annual benefit statements were not issued within the legal timescales, and particularly the statements that are sent to deferred members. So that's members who have left the pension fund but are not yet at retirement age. They were not issued in time, pretty much all of them. Equinity did give us assurances that they worked hard to make sure everything was issued by the 31st October, and everything was issued. And Michael did also report this to the pensions regulator, and the pensions regulator said they wouldn't take any further action as long as that end of October deadline was met. So therefore the pension regulator is also satisfied with how that was resolved. So we don't really see, there's no further action in relation to the 2021 benefit statements. That is now all closed, but obviously Equinity have recognised that there's a number of lessons that need to be learned as a result of the issues, and they've given really good assurances on that part, I would say. Chair, do you want me to pause after, given it's 3 subjects, or just carry on?
Yes.
Just carry on. Okay. So I think the annual benefit statements, I would say, has actually been quite successfully concluded despite the blip in their performance. The second one I'll touch on that we covered at the last meeting was the Gmp Reconciliation Exercise. in a nutshell, we had to do, as with every other pension scheme in the UK, we had to reconcile information in relation to the records that we held with what was held by DWP for anyone in a contracted out pension scheme. Massive amount of work to be done, and as a result of that reconciliation, and I would highlight of no fault of Hackney Pension Fund, there was just differences in the data, and therefore there was a number of pensioners, because of the change in this guaranteed minimum GMP figure, were either underpaid pension amounts or overpaid their pension amounts going back a number of years. So the exercise is now coming to an end, and as mentioned at the last meeting, the cases that were, I'll get this the right way around, underpaid were resolved in the October pensioner payroll, and they were paid arrears for the underpayments through the years with interest in those arrears. And the pensioners where they'd been receiving too much pension, i.e. they were being overpaid, they were given 2 months notice, so their adjustments are now being done at the end of November. So they've now, the November payroll has just gone through, and the lower paid pensions will be paid, but they did have 2 months notice. So the last committee, you asked for a bit more information in relation to the cases that were being resolved in October and November, and the table in paragraph 9.2 gives overview of the high number of cases, 71 underpayment cases and 414 overpayment cases. And we've also shown the figures there, such as the arrears for underpayment, the interest due on those arrears, put my teeth back in, and also the amount that was effectively written off because we didn't reclaim historical overpayments. We just reduced the pension from now for the future. We didn't go back and reclaim those historical overpayments. And you also asked for a bit more information about the profile of the pensions that were being reduced. So the graphs, which are at the bottom of paragraph 9.6, so just before paragraph 9.7, what they show is for every pensioner that's had a reduction of more than 10% of their pension. So there were 71 pensioners that had a reduction of more than 10% of their pensions. That's the more material reductions. The left-hand column shows the percentage reduction. So basically the reduction in their pension as a percentage. And then we've shown them by age in the top graph, and also by the actual annual amount of that reduction in the bottom graph. So that shows those 71 pensioners and gives you a better idea of the profile that they've had. So Equinity obviously have been monitoring the situation. When I think we did mention this at the last meeting, when they first sent out the letters, there was an awful lot of phone calls and they couldn't cope with the number of phone calls. So they took the decision to actually put a message on their answering phone, so that if people actually had a query requesting them to put it in writing, what actually happens if the person hang up, then fine, but if they didn't hang up, they would actually still get through and be able to speak to someone about their query. So there were a few letters that were received, 13 by writing or email, and they're still just resolving a couple of those, but it tended to be along the lines of individuals wanting a bit more information in relation to that. Lucy, who's the head of administration for the pension fund, is now working with Equinity to ask them to actually stop the answer phone message so that people get straight through if there's any further queries, because they just couldn't cope with the resource aspect at that point. If we have any, I don't have a really up-to-date update at the moment because the person who's been managing this project is on holiday this week. But I can, if there's any sort of major change in the numbers or if there's any complaints coming in, we can send an email around committee members before the next meeting just to give you an update, and we can definitely give you an update at the next meeting. There are still just under 300 cases that are still being looked at on an individual basis. They're more complicated cases, so they've got some more detailed calculations being carried out that may have further adjustments to be done. But again, we can update you on that at the next meeting. And the final point in the report, which is actually the middle section of the report, is a new matter that just came to light after the last meeting. So some of you may have heard of annual allowance, where as members of a pension scheme, the taxman will generally allow us to have £40,000 in capital values of pension savings each year. And if we exceed the £40,000, then we have to pay tax on the bit above the £40,000. That's a very simplified explanation of it. So every year, Equinity do checks to see if any of the scheme members in the Hackney Pension Fund might exceed that amount, and if they do, they have to send them a letter. So when they were doing the exercise for 2021, unfortunately, they found out that the letters they issued for 1920 were actually incorrect. Now, there was 20 letters issued. It's a small number of members, but it's still 20 members. And what had happened is they'd done all the calculations perfectly well, but then when they'd actually gone to put the information from the Excel spreadsheet into the letters, they'd actually linked it to the wrong Excel spreadsheet. So the wrong information had gone into the letters and they'd been sent out. So they're now going through them all and issuing those letters now with an explanation of what went wrong, and also providing guidance to those 20 members about how they re-notify HMRC of the change. We don't know the impact of this, because whether or not there was a tax charge is very much an individual circumstance, and it will depend on other things, such as does the individual have lots of investments or property or things like that. But my gut reaction is I think it will just be maybe one or two that there might actually be a tax implication as a result of that. And in theory, it could be a positive or a negative. We just don't know at this point in time. However, there is a facility where you can actually use any allowance on your annual allowance from the previous 3 years and carry it forward, which is why I think there's probably not going to be really many, if any, of the members probably impacted from a we owe the taxman perspective. It's probably more of a notification aspect. I'm sorry if that wasn't very clear. It is a bit of a complicated subject. So I'm really happy to answer any questions on any of those points, Chair.
Thank you, Karen. I should have said at the start that's Karen McWilliam, who's our Governance and Administration Advisor from Aon. Thank you. Right, Jonathan's showing a hand, and yeah, Jonathan.
Thank you, Chair. Can you hear me, everybody? Yes, good, fantastic. My point is, annual benefit statements, and I'm talking from a scheme member's representative perspective here, please. Annual benefit statements are very important to scheme members. I think it's important that they get as accurate as possible. I do pay tribute to the work that Karen and Aon have done in terms of trying to sort out Equinity. However, Equinity have underperformed rather handsomely over the last year to 18 months, unfortunately. I know it's been attended to, I know it's getting better, but nonetheless, I think we need to ask Equinity to provide us with a report, at least on an annual basis, perhaps in person at one of our meetings, about what is going on and what they're achieving and how they're improving, because some of their systems appear to be, all over the shop.
Okay, I know what you're saying there. I know also we're in open meeting at the moment, so it's a bit difficult to discuss in too much detail, but I think it's suffice to say that there have been a number of questions we've asked about the performance of this contract over the last series of meetings, aren't there? So I will undertake to have a discussion with our officers about the remarks and see how we might manage that at a future committee. Yeah. Anyone, any other questions or comments? Okay, first of all, the annual benefit statement, have we now, I mean, this has been a running problem, isn't it, for years, for various reasons, not always the same reason, but have we now cracked it?
So
He's not said yes, sorry.
so Equinity have certainly recognised that they need to put more resources into it, and they are doing a branch level review of the actual process they use at the moment. And as they've got someone new actually looking at the process with a fresh set of eyes, and we're obviously waiting for that. We're working with them to make sure, as far as we can, that we're comfortable with the new processes that they're putting in place. So hopefully, yes. Obviously, time will always tell, but they've definitely recognised they've got issues, and it's like a resourcing issue that they need to sort out, as well as the root process.
Okay, thank you. And the other questions on the GMP reconciliation. I think you recall when we did not first discussed it, but discussed this last, I think, at the committee. The committee is very concerned that it be handled in a sensitive and caring, I'll use that word, caring way, given the difficulty we could be causing quite a number of our pensioners. Are we confident that's happening?
We are being, and the fact that there has been no formal complaints. However, I do recognise we're talking about the elderly population here, so it is a little bit difficult to know 100%, which is why I'm not back. But we are being assured that they're dealing with them right, and they've got the right people dealing with it now.
Is there any way we could sort of redouble down on them on Equinity to make sure? I mean, because we are dealing obviously with some very elderly people here, aren't we? And some of them will be vulnerable because of that. And yeah, we have a duty to care to them, I think.
Yeah, we have already asked them to switch back off that message about writing in, so that they can talk direct to someone straight away if they need to. And obviously we'll get an update from around any queries, etc. they've had. So.
Okay. Jonathan, you got your hand up. Is that from last time, or do you want to come back again? You're on mute.
Yeah, Chair. Not me, sorry.
In that case, can we see no other hands? Can we note the report? No, thank you very much. So agenda item 11, government's policy and compliance statement review.
It is indeed. Thank you, Chair. So the governance policy and compliance statement is a statement that the fund is legally required to create and publish. And we've had it in place for a number of years. And in a nutshell, it summarises the fund's governance structure, including representation on bodies such as this, the Pension Committee, and also the responsibilities in relation to decision making. It's important to note that what is actually agreed at council. So by agreeing this policy statement, you're not actually changing the main governance structure, because any changes to the governance structure would actually need to be agreed at council. Because it's legally required, the governance policy and compliance statement has been in place for many, many years, and we tend to review it every 3 years. This time the review has been much more of actually can we make it a little bit more user friendly, because it was quite a long and difficult document to consider. But probably the one key bit that I would highlight to you is the objectives, which are outlined in pages 3 and 4, which have been reviewed a bit, and really with any strategy or policy, the objectives are really the key part of that strategy or policy. So I would hope that when you look at those objectives, you actually feel that they're appropriate from a governance perspective. Just to highlight the appendices to the policy, on Appendix A is basically a compliance statement against the Secretary of State's governance requirements. So basically, the Secretary of State has a number of areas around, you know, do you have a decision-making committee in place? Are there representatives on it? What do you do about training, etc.? And again, you are fully compliant against all the requirements within that compliance statement. And Appendix B is a schedule of delegations from you as a pension committee to allow business to be done at an appropriate speed, I would say. Generally, it's an appropriate speed. So it covers things like what is to happen if something urgent comes up in between meetings. How will a decision be made? It also covers things like minor changes to strategies and policies, which realistically would not take up good use of committee time, and therefore it's delegating matters such as that to be resolved by use of some of the senior officers, and particularly in a lot of cases it's with consultation of the chair. So there were some changes that we're recommending to update that Appendix B, which are shown. There is a sort of strike through version in the pack, which is the Appendix B to the Appendix B of the pack, if you understand that. Most of the changes are job titles, because the job titles in the team have changed, but there are a couple of areas also just bringing it up to date. For example, we had the new flexibilities in the FSS that were agreed about 2 committee meetings ago, so it refers to that, and just a couple of the delegated officer areas, we've just suggested some minor changes there as well. So that's really probably the most significant thing that does affect some decision making, but again, it's more about day-to-day things that we think is appropriate that can be done outside committee, so that the committee can focus on the more strategic matters. So the committee are being asked to approve the updated governance policy and compliance statement, including the updated delegations as shown in Appendix B of the policy. And again, Chair, I'm happy to take any questions.
Any questions or comments on this report? No? Okay, I thought it was very helpful and sensible update, and that actually, I think, simplified a bit and clarified a bit, I think I agree. Just to point, just to note where you referenced chairman and vice chairman, deputy chairman, that should be chair and vice chair of these conventions.
Thank you, Chair. The number of differences we have across the country is unbelievable. Thank you. One of my other chairs, if I called him a chair, he used to say, "I don't have 4 legs." So.
Yeah, I expect every authority you go to, you've got to do that differently.
That's it. Apologies, I got it wrong. I should have that.
Okay, just well, another question actually. What was it? Yeah. Oh yeah. On the review of consultations. Sorry, I can't. I've just read it a second ago. I should have made a mark on the form. Responses to consultations on LGPS matters. It's delegated. There's a delegation to officers there, subject to agreement with ourselves. I don't recall in recent times ever being asked to comment on a consultations, and I know they happen. But I mean, some of them. It's difficult, isn't it? Because quite a lot of them the committee doesn't really need to see, if we're honest. But there's a few I think would be of interest. So I mean, it should go, especially some of those things with a fundamental change to the way we work, you know. So just note that. I think it's just something you need to pick up on. Apart from that, thank you very much. So are there any comments or questions on it? No. In which case, can the updated statement as set out in the recommendations on the first page? Great. Thank you very much. I have not been notified of any other business, so just remains to thank you all for coming and close the meeting. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Have a nice evening.
Thank you.